Of course, everyone knows Pac-Man, and to do a franchise in Lowe's covering the entire Pac-Man franchise would be an act of essentially suicide. So I've decided to go a little bit narrower for this one, and I'm doing Pac-Man platform games, of which there are a surprising number, roughly 15. So let's take a look at them. Okay, 1984 brought us the first Pac-Man platformer to my knowledge, that is Packland. That's a really rather unusual video game for several reasons. I mean, first of all, obviously, a side-scrolling take on Pac-Man. That's interesting in general, but it didn't use like a conventional joystick. You had like one button to go left, one button to go right, and a jump button. And you speed up by double tapping the buttons, much like you would in, like, say, a side-scrolling beat 'em up or something. To run, you would double tap the direction. You're playing as Pac-Man, except now he's got a sort of nice little hat, and the object is to go, left to right through what's called in this game trips, which is pretty funny when you think about it. Now you go through your trips and then you turn around and you go back in the other direction. And that's your trip made. You're pursued by ghosts as ever, although they're not quite so active in hunting you down in this one. You're collecting power pills to eat them. You're collecting fruit, as in the original Pac-Man, and it's a challenging game due to being an arcade game and everything. There's like a nice focus on taking your money. Although, having said that, it's not among the most challenging arcade platformers. I mean, it's reasonable. It is definitely difficult. That's helped in no way by the sort of awkward control scheme. But of course, later versions of the game, like the version in like Namco Museum and Pac-Man Collection and all that sort of thing, you can just use your D-pad like you would normally, which it's more natural feeling. It feels better. It feels right to do that. So the original arcade version, while it's an awesome sort of curio, it's not the best version to play because of the bizarre control scheme, which I imagine... I mean, I don't want to just talk shit, but I think Donkey Kong was 82, so I don't think it was quite standardised yet, and of course Super Mario Brothers, I believe, was 85, so this actually does predate that, which is astonishing, to be honest. You'll notice that the parallax sort of scrolling is actually still kind of good looking. I think the game does still look kind of good because it has a really clean line style that it's hard to explain, but it doesn't look like tiles, if that makes sense. It all looks very cohesive, and I actually think it looks rather good. I think it's a pretty iconic looking video game. I particularly like the way that the water looks with the sort of flowing parallax waves. It's really impressive stuff. And when you go into like the forest and you've got the trees moving in front of you, it's a pretty great looking game in my opinion. Not the best to play, but it's just the first one. We've got a lot to get through yet. It's probably worth mentioning the US version, which I've been primarily showing, is based more on the Pac Man Hanna-Barbera animated series. And it includes, say, like Ms. Pac-Man and Baby Pac based on their appearance in that TV show. Whereas the Japanese version has your sort of Pac-Man with his absurdly long Pinocchio nose and like the break time areas of churches with a cross on the top of them. And of course, back in the day, that was a bit of a no-no. So there aren't many huge differences, but the animated series stuff was the most prominent of them. Well, it took 11 years, but they actually released another Pac-Man side-scroller for the Super Nintendo called Packin Time, which I believe to be a humorous reference to the phrase back in time. I don't know. Anyway, Packin Time is an interesting one because it's not entirely an original Pac-Man game. The Super Nintendo game is original in that all the levels are original, but it's sort of the sequel to a game called Fury of the Furries, which is an Amiga and DOS game. Now, interestingly enough, Packin Time was also released on the Game Boy and on DOS itself, and the DOS version of the game and the Game Boy version are basically ports of the original Amiga Fury of the Furries game, while the Super Nintendo Packin Time is the sequel. It's interesting how much in this game actually does carry over to the later 3D Pac-Man platformers, but I say that, I mean, it's not a terrific amount, but it's like Pac-Man's sort of bouncy nature, like the fact he can rebound off surfaces and stuff, that does come into play in the later games. But then again, it doesn't take an incredibly creative designer to look at Pac-Man and think he's like a bouncy ball, you know. But anyway, the actual gameplay in Packin Time is pretty, I want to say pretty unique, because you make your way around the world and you have to sort of go through these coloured rings to collect new items or new like skills. Like one of them is shooting fireballs, which lets you defeat enemies. One of them is a hammer that lets you smash certain walls and break through certain surfaces. One of them is a sort of ninja rope, much like the one in the Worms series, where you can swing around on the ceiling, which is always fun to do. And the last one that I've seen is the bubble, which basically just lets you swim and shoot bubbles out of your mouth to destroy enemies. The gameplay is largely sort of collect 'em up, because you have to get every single Pac Dot to finish the level, much like in, you know, Pac-Man. That's not something that they kept doing for the later Pac-Man platformers, though. It's pretty challenging, it's not unfair, and it's the movement takes a little bit of time to get used to, because of, like I mentioned, how bouncy Pac-Man is. You can tell it's based on an Amiga game because of the way that... I mean, if you're familiar with Amiga platformers, it has a lot of the tropes from them, like the hidden secrets and the generally slightly finicky controls, but I enjoyed it. I think it's a pretty good time. I don't think it's a masterpiece, but I think it's a good game, and I do recommend giving it a go. The DOS and Game Boy versions are fun as well, but they're not quite up there with the Super Nintendo one, which is, because it was created for Super Nintendo, it feels a little bit more polished, it feels a little bit better, it doesn't feel entirely like you're just playing some random ass Amiga game, which is what you are doing when you play it on DOS or Game Boy. Released in 1999, Pac Man World for the PS1 is an anniversary celebration game that, I mean, it didn't set the world alight, but it's not bad. It's a bit of an odd duck. When I was younger, I thought this was a, like, unsung platforming sort of piece of brilliance, but having played it again for this video, I do have problems with it, although I still rather like it. I think it's a interesting sort of halfway house between 2D and 3D, because the levels are obviously navigated in, you know, 3 dimensions, but they're very linear, with an exception of, you know, you can go into the screen and out of the screen a little bit, much like like in Packland, like a sort of side-scrolling beat-em-up in a way. It's a very sort of regimented experience. Pac-Man feels very stiff to control. I mean, at the best of times he feels stiff to control. There are mechanics present in the game that are very much not sort of stiff and all over the place, and that's one of the problems I have with it, which I'll explain shortly. Essentially your goal here is just a sort of traditional PS1-ish platformer where you make your way through the stage. You have to, you know, get to the exit. That's all there is to it, left to right. Though in most of the stages, I find getting to the exit is actually quite easy. It's getting 100% that's the challenge, and when you're doing that, the levels sort of, they don't open up, but they become very intricate and sort of difficult to navigate, because every level is composed of these sort of doors and switches, and you need to open the doors by finding the corresponding fruit that unlocks the door, because fruits are keys now, I guess. Pac-Man just kind of mashes a banana into the lock, I don't know. But it means that you'll see a door with like a grape on it, and you'll think, okay, I need a grape. You'll go like a bit further through the level, find a grape, and then you'll be like, okay, I guess I need to go back now. And that's the pattern throughout pretty much the entire game. There are a few concessions to friendliness, like you'll sometimes find a trail of dots that you automatically will eat, and it will sort of warp you back where you were, but you spend a lot of time backtracking, and the obstacles aren't really sufficiently different approaching them backwards so that they are approaching them forwards to make it not get a little bit arduous in time. And it's also because they hadn't quite cottoned on to the fact that limited lives are stupid yet, so you have well, limited lives, and in a game like this, that doesn't add a lot, it just adds frustration, because it's not easy when you're actually trying to get 100%, and I mean, if you're not trying to get 100%, there's not much point in playing the game, because that is the game. The straightforward left to right navigation is so basic that you needn't really bother doing it. Don't bother playing this unless you want to do well at it. That's the only way to have fun. A little bit like say Sonic CD, where if you're just playing left to right, then there really is no point. But if you're playing to get 100%, it's pretty much a masterpiece. Except I've confused that, because this isn't a masterpiece, I've decided. It is good if you can get hold of it for the PS1, and I think it's available on PS3 like classics as well. It is rather good. You'll have a fun time with it if you like Pac-Man, if you like this kind of gameplay. It has these interesting mechanics that persist for a few games, like a little bit like in Packin Time, you can do a sort of butt bounce that keeps you going higher, except in this game it's your offensive attack as well. And you also do something called a rev roll, which is basically a Sonic the Hedgehog spin attack, where Pac-Man runs on the spot, and then when you release it, he dashes forward or rolls forward, like as a ball. It is Sonic. So it's an interesting hodgepodge of different platforming elements with a bunch of Pac-Man stuff in there. Like there are some Pac-Man style mazes in there, but they're really easy because in the mazes you have 3 hits, and Pac-Man's only tricky because you have, one hit. If you had 3 hits, anyone could get to the kill screen in Pac-Man, so it's a little bit silly. But it's decent. They expand on it in the later ones, as I'll now go on to discuss. Of course, I should probably mention this came out on PS1, and they also ported it to the GBA. The GBA port is a little bit cut down, but it's adequate. It's pretty fun on the GBA, actually, because the levels are quite... They're not short, but they're not long either, so they're perfect for kind of bite-size, I'll play one level and save and do something else. The music on the GBA version is absolute shite, though. I would just turn it off and listen to some music or something, because it's so badly compressed and so crackly, and that's a problem that's going to come back later as well. Anyway, yeah, that's Pac Man World. Pac Man World 2 released for the PlayStation 2, Xbox, GameCube and PC. You know what, I've just assumed it was released on the Xbox, it might not have been. I should check, but it's me. Anyway, Pac Man World 2, obviously the sequel to Pac Man World. It's the, air quotes, next-gen take on the concept, and it's quite a big improvement, actually. It has its flaws, which I'll get into. Essentially, the level size has been made less insane. The game feels a lot more like an actual 3D platformer, although there are problems with the camera. I think in a lot of cases the camera is just too close to Pac-Man from behind, and it makes it a little bit hard to see what you're doing. His shadow on the ground could be a little bit more defined too. I mean, that's hard to explain, except for, in practice you'll understand what I mean, because it's a little bit hard to judge some of the jumps this game asks you to do. It's a super linear, straightforward sort of linear platformer. It doesn't have the backtracking that Pac Man World 1 has, but it has a lot of extremely well-hidden secrets and items, which appeals to me greatly. You don't need to collect all of the Pac dots in this one, thankfully, but the game will record if you do, and that's how you get 100%. You get all the fruit and you get all of the dots. So very much a linear collect-em-up platformer. Nice graphics too. I mean, you could call it a little bit generic, but I like games like this. I always have liked games like this, and to again be cliched, they don't make them like this anymore. So it's nice to play something so transparently, straightforwardly. Here is a 3D platformer from the PS2 generation. GameCube version is the best one, as is often the case. It's a lot smoother and the graphics are a lot nicer, but you can't really go wrong with any of them. The PC one I don't think you can play anymore because of DRM on the disc. I had big DRM problems back in the day, even though I owned a legit copy of it. I could barely play it without just screwing around with settings and things, because it was just like, there's like slight damage to the CD, it wouldn't let me play it, which is absolute fucking ridiculous bullshit, but that's just how it is. So yeah, Pac Man World 2, weirdly enough, there's not a lot to say about this one because it is quite straightforward, but if you like 3D platformers, it's a good time because it's a good example of one. The boss fights are pretty cool as well, but I don't really want to spoil them because they're pretty funny. So yeah, big improvement on Pac Man World, if a little bit less esoteric than that one is. They also made a version of Pac Man World for the GBA, which is more of a sort of 2D platformer for obvious reasons, but weirdly enough, it does retain the sort of perspective thing from the original Pac Man World, which is actually the main problem with it, because it's a pretty impressive game, but like it's nice looking, it feels good to play and everything, but unfortunately the perspective tricks that it pulls to differentiate it, I guess, from other games, make it so that some of the jumps are just simply difficult to judge because you can't quite tell if you're on the level with them. I mean, they've made the effort to rectify that with a lot of good use of like shadows and things and all the power-ups and all the platforms, but it's still a little bit more awkward than it needs to be. Pac Man World 2 for GBA, recommended if you can find it for a good price, but it shouldn't be that hard because it's not like that many people give a shit about Pac Man World 2 on the GBA. I think you can get it as a pack-in with Ms. Pac-Man Maze Madness, which I'm not covering because it's not a platformer, but it is a really good Pac-Man game. Just going to throw a quick shout to Pack and Roll, the 2005 DS game, which I believe may have been a launch title. It's kind of a platform game. You roll Pac-Man around like a ball as if he's in, say, Marble Madness or something, although the controls are a lot more intuitive than Marble Madness. You just stroke the stylus over the giant Pac-Man on the bottom screen to navigate him around the stages, collect dots, and reach the exit. I'm just going to mention it very briefly because it's really good, and I recommend everyone give it a go if they like games where you roll a ball around. And weirdly enough, for a DS game, I think it still looks pretty impressive for what it is. I mean, it's more form over it's a function over form, I guess the phrase would actually be. But it looks nice, it's fun to play, and it's pretty frigging good, and I recommend it a lot. So play that. If you don't want to get hold of the DS version, they ported it to the Wii game Namco, I believe it's called Remix Collection on the Wii, Namco Remix Collection, yeah. Which was a bunch of old Namco arcade games and a bunch of remakes of games like Dig Dug and Rally X and stuff like that. And one of them was a Pack and Roll, and it's basically the levels from the DS game, but obviously with nicer graphics, and you use the straight analog stick control rather than fucking around with the stylus. And it's good. It's really fun. It's a really fun way to play the game. It doesn't have, obviously, the handheld thing. It doesn't have the tactile sense of actually physically rolling Pac-Man, but if you don't need that, then this is a good version to go for. And I think Namco Remix Collection is pretty easy to find as well compared to the DS game, so yeah, recommended. Pac Man World 3 was released for the PS2 in 2005, and it's kind of a weird one. Sorry, I should say PS2 and GameCube. I don't know if it was released on the Xbox. Again, I'm not checking. The Xbox sucks anyway. Sorry, I realise how fanboyish that is, but it just didn't seem like an interesting console to me. Anyway, as you can probably see, Pac Man 3 is a bit kind of friggin' ugly compared to the other ones. It's set in a much more industrial-style landscape. It has the freest sort of 3D camera of the series, and it's very close to your given sort of PS2, let's say Ratchet game or Jack game, one of those games. It's a little bit like one of those, except there's a lot more focus on platforming than either. Now, when it came out, I recall it getting absolutely trashed in the reviews, but again, I've never really cared about reviews, so I really like it. I love platformers, this is a platformer, and I really enjoy it. It's interesting to see what they did with the sort of less linear game design, although, I mean, you're still going from the beginning to the end, but there aren't really sort of specific divided up levels. I mean, obviously there are levels, but they kind of flow together. Like you save at save terminals as you play through the game. You don't get like a results screen or anything. And for the first time, Pac-Man is fully voiced, and they made him into a sort of slightly sarcastic white guy, which is kind of not how I imagined Pac-Man, yet at the same time, yeah, fair enough. That's Pac-Man. Yeah, it's a good game. It plays smoothly. The level design is pretty good. It's not turgid. You know, I mean, it's a little bit turgid visually because it's all just so grim looking, and I don't associate that with Pac-Man. Although I guess the mazes that he exists in would be pretty fucking grim. Just blue walls and pills on the floor, and chased by spectres, which is kind of his life, isn't it? So it's an interesting take on Pac-Man as character action game, I guess, because I mean it has combat, like Pac-Man like punches the crap out of things, and it's just odd, you know. I want to see. I mean, I expect Pac-Man to eat things, but if they wanted to do a more sort of grown-up Pac-Man, they couldn't really have him like cannibalizing people or just consuming them. Although one of the next games they actually do that, except obviously it's not realistic. But Pac-Man's always been one of those things where if you think about it, it's kind of revolting. 8 years later, Pac-Man's back in Pac Man and the Ghostly Adventures, released for the PS3, 360 and PC in 2013. It's actually very similar to the early Pac World games. It takes most from Pac Man World 3 because it has the free-roaming camera and everything. But it's pretty... weirdly enough, it's a lot simpler than those games. You have different forms that you transform into, but they don't really change the gameplay particularly in any way you haven't seen before. It's a pretty basic platformer, but in this era, that's quite rare. Again, you don't... I mean, 3D platformers are pretty much a niche genre at this point. All you get really are the indie ones like a Hat in Time and Poi, and every so often, if you're lucky, you'll get a Mario. But I mean, Mario Galaxies were a while ago now, and it was nice to get another game like this. And of course, this isn't on the level of Mario Galaxy, but it's a solid game visually. It's pretty fun to play, and it doesn't have any glaring frigging problems with it, so that's a huge boost. The weirdest thing is, in the PS2 era, this would have been reviewed like shit. And because these games were 10 a penny, and now that they're not, online it's pretty well liked. I mean, the actual critical reviews aren't great, but when you look up videos of it and stuff, people seem to dig it, because you just don't get games like this, and they cater to an audience. My friends who like platformers all enjoyed it. I mean, I recommended it to them, and the second one, which we'll get to. So yeah, Pac Man and Ghostly Adventures, it's much better than the fucking TV series, which is obsessed with farts and stuff, and is awful. I don't like the way Pac-Man looks, but I can live with it because it means I get to play a fun platformer that doesn't feel like it was made for 5p. Inti Creates were responsible for the 3DS version of Pac Man and the Ghostly Adventures, which is a 2D platformer with a heavy focus on eating enemies. It's pretty poor, to be honest. It's okay. I bought it on sale on the eShop, and it's a really weirdly bland game, because Inti Creates have a habit of making games that I like. They made other than the excellent Mega Man Zero games and like the Azure Striker Gunvolt games, which I also think are excellent, fight me, they made games for the DS, such as the Kuroro Gunso games, which you might know as Sergeant Frog, and that was really fucking good. It was really impressive, solid. Again, pretty much a basic platformer with a little nod towards the Klonoa School of Puzzling. But I'm not talking about that, maybe later. But Pac-Man and the Ghostly Adventures for 3DS is... it's basic. It's really... It's the kind of basic, like... Of course, all the games are fairly basic, but they're basic with good level design, and this is basic with kind of nothing. So I can't truly recommend this one. The sequel, however, which I'll get to, I can recommend very, very highly. Finally, in 2014, we got Pac Man and the Ghostly Adventures 2, which is a straight sequel to the original, also released for PS3 and 360, and they didn't bother releasing it on the PC this time for some reason, the absolute bastards. Oh, I think it was also released on the Wii U, but who cares? Anyway, you'd be forgiven for thinking it's the same exact game. The graphics are ever so slightly improved, the level design is definitely stronger, it's a much stronger game. I was very pleasantly surprised by this one. It's later in the game it gets weirdly Mario Galaxy-ish in terms of the crazy platforming stuff that it makes you do. Obviously it never reaches the height of Mario Galaxy because nothing has or probably ever will, but it's a damn solid experience. It's pretty cheap to get now as well. It's difficult to know what to say about it, much like some of these other games, because it is very similar to the previous one. Eating a line of ghosts to fly around is always fun though. I do want to point out the 3DS port, and I'm not going to show footage of it because it looks the same pretty much as the PS3 version. Because, okay, that's facetious. basically, they got really ambitious and they decided to port the entire game to the 3DS. Now, it didn't really work because the frame rate is bad. It is not made to run on that system, but if you can forgive a poor frame rate, you have got a full-fledged console 3D platforming experience right there. And it's very frequently cheap, so if you're not a tech freak, if you can deal with stuff that runs at pretty much 20 frames per second the entire time, you have got a damn fun platformer there for you to play. So yeah, I recommend picking this up on the 3DS and also the PS3 as well, because it's solid. It's a good platformer. I recommend it. So those are the Pac Man platformers. If I've missed any, please feel free to let me know in the comments. I really hope I haven't, but if I have, maybe I'll do like an addendum video with just the last couple that I've somehow managed to miss in my genuinely relatively intense research. Thanks for watching. I was originally going to do Mega Man X for this video, but quite frankly, I just didn't have the time or energy to do it because there are a lot of Mega Man X games, and I have a lot to say about every single individual one of them. Maybe eventually I'll get around to it, but that's a long-haul job, and we'll see. We'll just see, because I want to put out Franchise and Lows more regularly. Ideally, I do Video World every month and Franchise and Lows every month, but I got stuff to do. I got to do my life, and I can't be doing that all the time. Unfortunately, I work on other stuff too. I work on comics. I write. I record a podcast, etc., etc., etc. I know I'm wanking on about shit nobody cares about, but I got to do other stuff other than talk about video games. So yeah, thanks very much, and see you next time for the next episode, the subject of which I am yet to decide. Oh, and by the way, you may have noticed I have a cold. I would normally not record when I had a cold, but I promised I would have this out this weekend, so, yeah. 'Cause I got Pac Man fever.